Hi, welcome to your Benedictine Care Chapter 3 study companion video. In this chapter, we start looking at stability of heart and persevering in uncomfortable. This is such a big chapter. We're going to start unifying our mind and what we've been focusing on from chapters 1 and 2 to unifying that with dropping into our heart of hearts where that inmost wisdom within us and our lighter voice dwells, and how do we experience communion and companionship with them. This chapter, Introducing Contemplative Practice, is such an important, was so important in my own faith formation and my own reestablishing my personal relationship with God. In college, to give you just a brief history of how, my own personal experience of how it brought me back into my spirituality. In college, so quite a while ago, in an upper level psychology course, I was introduced to centering prayer. And at that time, we could choose, it was transpersonal psychology, and we could choose for that semester from a variety of different spiritual traditions to do our project from for the coursework. And center prayer was offered as one of the options, as was yoga. And so I, at that time, selected yoga. I was raised Catholic, but I was in the pretty, stereotypical story of not thinking that my faith that I had grown up in had anything to offer me now. And I, use the language of identifying as spiritual, but not religious. Um, but when we identify that, when we say spirituality is how we nurture our relationship with the divine, I wasn't spiritual. I wasn't nurturing that relationship. I moved forward with good intention and I was being a good person, but I didn't have an awareness. I didn't have an introduction yet to how to really practice spirituality in a way of nurturing that relationship with the divine. And so I selected yoga and did that reading and did my project, went on to study Buddhism and different types of yoga for the next 25 years of looking down different paths with different forms of meditation, really trying to find that way that connected to something that I could feel a disconnection, but I couldn't articulate it. And so, a bit ironically, I had bought the Thomas Keating's Open Mind, Open Heart book at the time of that coursework in college. And I read it shortly after, but it still didn't feel like it resonated or applied to me. I was still very intent and interested. There was culturally, we were getting a lot of awareness on meditation, and it felt that this is where my spirituality could really develop. And so, as I mentioned, I went through that for about 25 years. And throughout that time, about every 4 or 5 years, I would reread Thomas Keating's Open Mind, Open Heart. And it wasn't until about 5 years ago where I read a particular line in there that had stuck out to me differently than it ever had. And in his language, I'll paraphrase him saying that if you practice this consistently every day, you will know if it's right for you. And what just really struck me with that is I had realized that I had never committed to that consistent practice with centering prayer and with a contemplative practice. And I said, okay, I can do that. I've been exploring other paths. I'm not getting consistency or traction there either. Something still feels disconnected. And so it was, essentially a kind of a why not? Why not take that advice and practice it consistently every day. And I did, um, and everything unfolded from there. It was just my own ways of starting to get reconnected to my lighter voice and to start hearing my personal nudges of where to go next. It all started unfolding from there. There have been many things along the way that have complemented it and are also essential to my own personal spiritual formation. But I can accredit the introduction to the contemplative dimension of, in this case, particularly with Christianity, but with these contemplative dimensions of this traditional spiritual traditions, the monotheistic religions. So there's Sufism in Islam, there is Kabbalah in Judaism, and our own contemplative practices from the monastic traditions within Christianity. And there's this beautiful unifying, it's called the perennial tradition, that unifies all of these in this description of us moving into these silent places, our own personal embodied divine indwelling, and sitting and resting in union with that divine indwelling as the source of love, as how we can transform our existing thought patterns, of how we can move forward in an expression of love. And in, my own belief is of how that experiencing that type of love is the love thy neighbor as thyself. I don't think many of us know what loving ourselves feels like. And how are we then expected to extend that to those in our community and those in our families and to ourselves, quite frankly? So we've been given this beautiful directive to extend love, and we have shifted our attention away from how we first experience and feel that love for and within ourselves so that it can be an extension of us. So, with that history, let's go ahead and get started together on your introduction or your companionship, if this isn't your first introduction, of seeing what nuggets within this can resonate with you and what can complement your current practices, to help with the story and understanding of how that applies to making change. And how does the information introduced in chapters 1 and 2 with our advocates and with our lighter voice and being able to observe them, how does that now move forward with our practices in chapter 3? So super excited to do this with you, and to share my experience and my thoughts. And I will be so excited to hear your experiences as you integrate this into your consistent intention as well. So let's go ahead and get started. So, as a reminder, in chapter 1, let's just quickly recap of where we've been. So, in chapter 1, stability of intention, the challenge that we introduced was our current belief that we face this need for control. That if I do this first, then I will get this result that I want, or I will obtain this quality of life that I haven't experienced yet. We realize that we're more willful in trying to control that than willing and receptive to having that divine connection. How that experience and how we experienced that as we began to practice that was introducing our shifting away from our divine relationship and that divine connection, and what could happen in our experience if we began to shift that attention back to the divine. And that is when we have our attention on the divine, that is how we increase our receptivity for our lighter voice and for that true source of healing and strength. And the practice that was introduced, and hopefully you have been doing as often as you remember, and is our turn towards then act. A simple deep breath, a pause, shifting our attention, and increasing that receptivity to that divine strength, that we can consistently make the transformative changes that we're hoping for. So then in chapter 2, we looked at, okay, now that I'm turning towards, I really hear a lot when I do that. And maybe you experienced that you had less trust than you thought for those voices once you started turning towards, that our advocates and our bullies can actually start saying, yeah, no, that isn't the way that we really are going to be more comfortable. Or, that's pretty threatening. I don't think we're going to be secure when we do this. And it's really interesting to hear ourselves doubt ourselves and to then actually take a course of action that is misaligned with what we feel is right, really in our heart of hearts. And so hopefully just that simple practice of starting to turn towards and shift our attention made us aware of that challenge. And that's a beautiful part of this process, is becoming aware of that, and that it is going to feel challenging, and we're going to have to wrestle with what the reality is versus when we start doing these practices, then where they're leading us and what we will experience as we have consistency. So once we started bringing those advocates forward, we talked about how they were formed and how within the nervous system, how they were actually acting out of love for us when we weren't exposed to or didn't have the resources provided to us from other sources. And so this was how we started developing these default patterns that were very successful at alleviating distress. And so we talked about not just ignoring them and telling them to shut up and to tell them to, not have a say in this. We actually questioned and said, well, what if we bring them forward, bring that strength of execution and that desire to have our well-being and our protection? What if we put that in service to our lighter voice? So we also talked in chapter 2 about this power of next, and how once we turn towards, and when we can start hearing these different voices, in particular when we can start tweezing out and discerning our lighter voice, our divinely led voice, and our inner wisdom from that, that's how we, in that moment, we can perceive and we can become receptive to what is that just one next step to take. And we talked about it as dancing with the divine, that this isn't to be an arduous task that makes life feel constantly uncomfortable. There are moments of joy within the challenge. And if we can remember that we're being held by and dancing with the divine in each of these next moments, that helping animate them, like we talked about with the advocates and the bullies, when we can animate or bring them into joyful imagery, it can really help us reframe and enjoy this process of starting to look at when we stand in this space, and if it feels barren, we can actually make it feel more joyful. We talked about in chapter 2 that when you observe those patterns, when you just start observing them, you're disrupting them. We talked about that in chapter 1 too, where just when you're reading in the most ordinary of moments, when you can pause and check in with your physical body, that's our biospiritual pauses, when you can check into how am I embodying this experience? What in my nervous system is starting to respond to this? And just by observing that, you stop it. You disrupt it. Even if it continues to move forward, you at least disrupt that established pattern. And that is what is needed for us to go into transforming those patterns into new patterns that are more aligned with the resources that we have now. We also talked in chapter 2 that as you start doing this, you will hear invitations to explore additional resources. That this is just what we're introducing in Benedictine care is really just to start cracking open your experience. And that experience is going to include additional people and additional resources and additional practices that are going to enrich and complement your own personal experience with spiritual transformation. So, chapter 2 in our practice, we took our turn towards a little bit deeper. And when we turned towards, when we could start discerning those voices, we started nurturing our advocates. We started recognizing that they were there. We stopped criticizing that they had to be different or they had to be, that they weren't acceptable. We started saying, okay, I see you. How do we move forward together? So now in chapter 3, we get to take a look at, okay, when we stood in that space a little bit longer and when we started nurturing these advocates, what did that start feeling like? Again, Benedictine care is continually brings us into the context of making lifestyle choices, making the most ordinary of lifestyle choices, and how do we directly integrate our spirituality into that ordinariness of daily life. So we keep looking at what is this sacred sliver of space before a choice? And what is our experience like when we stand there and when we try to disrupt these patterns and do something different? So in chapter 3, once we've been standing there, we've discerned voices, we're nurturing advocates, we can begin to have this realization of just how small that sacred sliver of space really is. We can realize how uncomfortable it is to stand in that tiny sliver of space. We can realize how powerful those shadow voices really are. We can realize how they act directly against our true intentions. And that can surprise us. That can be those moments when we're standing there and we know we would answer if somebody would say, well, do you want to have better health? Do you want to feel more creative? Like when we have, everybody would say, of course I do. But we start realizing that in this space, that isn't what we hear we want. We want those things that provide relief and comfort. And they are different than what we know we want. That even when we know and it isn't just a should, they kind of feel like, well, I should want to be healthy. But in the quietest moments with yourself, that is what you long for, is that connection, those times where despite weight, this isn't associated with a number on the scale, but it's associated about when you experience health in a way, in a comfort within your body, that you feel like that extension of love. You feel open versus restricted. You feel like extending and having conversations and sharing time with other individuals versus turtling and being isolated and withdrawn. And it can be really hard and very uncomfortable when we realize that we have a very powerful side of us that is actually against that. And that's that true self, false self. And the false self, even though misdirected, it is still making those choices in some attempt to give you control, security, and esteem. So, how wonderful to first start being able to notice them and observe them so that we can start working with and bringing that lighter voice forward as the mentor. And that's our realization that we do need help in untangling those advocate stories. The question that chapter 3 asks is, how do we persevere in that sacred sliver of space when we want to have transformative behavior change, when we want to finally just do something different? How do we persevere when it feels this uncomfortable to stand there and trying not to do that established default pattern? And how are we to persevere when trying to change to align what we know we want in our heart of hearts, when trying to make that change actually creates the very distress that your advocates are trying to protect you from? So now when you say, well, I'm not going to participate in that behavior, but it was how you got comfort, and now you're not going to do that, there's a lot of anxiety and feeling threatened that you're not going to be comfortable. And that's a really legitimate place to be and to validate that that is the experience, that can be the experience. So how are we supposed to persevere in that if that's how transformative change is supposed to come about? So our starting place with Benedictine care, and now in chapter 3, is to look at our starting place for being able to persevere there is to enlarge that sacred sliver of space before a choice. It feels tiny. It feels like we miss it when we first are starting to get started with it. But our opportunity is how that experience will feel when we enlarge that space, when we have more time before we execute a pattern. Within that space and time, that's where we'll be allowed to do something differently. So in chapter 3, we introduce an important analogy that's going to carry us into the rest of Benedictine care. And that analogy is feeling that those automatic thought patterns actually feel like a 1,000-pound door slamming shut in front of us. It feels like before we even realize what's happened, before we have an automatic behavior, that 1,000-pound door has just slammed shut. And we weren't even aware of it before. But now that we turn towards and we're actually aware of it, we can feel incredibly powerless to think we would ever be able to stop that 1,000-pound door from automatically slamming shut, let alone thinking that there was any way that we could actually control when that door opened and that we could move into the space behind the door into something that we haven't experienced yet. And when we're first getting started, that can feel just unreasonable that that's going to be the experience. But this is where we get to go together. So when we feel that 1,000-pound door shutting, that is our opportunity to start moving from our minds, that 1,000-pound door, those automatic patterns, those advocates executing control, security, and esteem. We move from that happening in our mind that we talked about in length in chapters 1 and chapter 2, that's what's going on up there. We move from our mind to behind that door into our heart of hearts. Moving from the automatic to different, to having the space and time to align our actions to our divinely led inner wisdom, aligning that to what we actually do. And how do we, chapter 3 introduces how we make that transition, how we start getting our foot in front of that 1,000-pound door, how we move into our heart of hearts, where that indwelling, like this is where our lighter voice lives within us, our lighter voice, our inner wisdom. That is where they live within us and where their connection is to the divine. So, how do we join them? How do we get to spend time with them and nurture that relationship? How do we spend time with them and have new experiences with them rather than being stuck up here and stuck just in the slamming doors and advocates and having life feel this willful versus willing? And chapter 3 introduces that we do that through silence. We join our lighter voice and the divine through silence. And that is contemplative practice. It is bonding time for you to spend with the divine in your lighter voice. It's where you bond and have new experiences and prioritize the relationship of getting to know each other. The only thing you need to be able to start doing a contemplative practice is intention and consent. There is nothing else for us to do. We cannot willfully sit down to do a contemplative practice or sit to do a centering prayer session and sit and say, okay, this is what's going to happen. I am going to feel divinely inspired. I'm going to hear with clarity the lighter voice. I'm going to be able to, in 20 minutes, I'm going to be able to solve this problem. No, that is exactly what we are untangling. There is nothing for us to do. What happens and what our experience is as a result of doing these practices is completely given as gift and grace. It is given to us as a gift if we can stay receptive to receiving it. It becomes the invitations and those nudges that we introduced in chapter 2. It comes as increased receptivity and opening that channel between the mind and the heart of hearts, and reversing the flow that the direction comes from our heart of hearts, and our minds, our beautiful faculties of our minds, begin to be able to execute what is in our heart of hearts. And so there is nothing within contemplative practices except intention and consent. So intention to bond and nurture that relationship with the beloved, and consent to allow them to act within you. Anything else, any other intention or goal from doing this practice is a psychological mindfulness or relaxation technique. And that is what distinguishes contemplative spirituality from mindfulness practices. And as beautiful as they are, and as beautiful as they can be as tools to our lifestyle as medicine, they are not contemplative spirituality. To be contemplative spirituality, there must be that intent to nurture your relationship with the divine. That is spirituality. So in our practices, what we get to start experiencing in chapter 3, we introduce those challenges of, again, coming off of chapter 2, of how that sacred sliver of space feels. And so now our experience with chapter 3, with our new practices and our new awareness of bringing that contemplative, of moving into our heart of hearts with our lighter voice and bonding time with the divine, we get to experience that movement, that moving from that 1,000-pound door automatically slamming shut to having a new experience of silence and openness. We enter our heart of hearts to join our lighter voice in the divine, to just be with them, to bond and nurture that relationship. No other intention, no other intention. It will unfold from there. There's nothing you can do to make an experience happen. Every time you sit, it will be different. Some of them will feel peaceful, some of them will feel tumultuous, some of them you'll wonder why you're doing this. Every single time you sit will feel different, and that's the experience. All you need to do is have that intention and consent and acceptance for what happens. This will align, have that experience of beginning to better hear and align your will to theirs. This will give you that increased strength to persevere in the storm, in what it sounds like when you stand in that sacred sliver of space. This is the experience of receiving what I talk about in the chapter. It's Father Thomas Keating talks about divine therapy, of centering prayer and our contemplative practices being divine therapy, where there's nothing for us to do but allow the divine to help start untangling those advocates' stories for their need for control, security, and esteem. And this is where we start to enlarge that sacred sliver of space before our choices, where we get our foot in front of that door. And when we first initially start doing that, it is going to feel like we put our foot in front of a 1,000-pound door. It's going to hurt. We're going to be very aware of it. We're going to feel like it's never going to get more comfortable, but it will. And each time we do it, that door loses strength and we gain it. So with our practice in chapter 3, the following video that I do is I will do a 20-minute guided sit. There are a lot of resources provided in the chapter. There is resources for joining live groups on Zoom. All of those are encouraged to have as one of our resources if it works for kind of an on-demand guided centering prayer sit. I will create that video after this. So I do encourage, and I'm going to put the links as well. I really encourage, if centering prayer feels like your introduction that you want to explore, I really, really encourage you to watch those 4 introductory videos. They used to only do these introductions to centering prayers via live workshops, and during COVID, Contemplative Outreach did an online publicly available 4-part series, and it's wonderfully done, and it is so complementary to reading Open Mind, Open Heart and other things from Father Keating. But it's a wonderful introduction to these 4 simple guidelines right here. The choosing of the sacred word as that symbol of your intention to consent to God's presence and action within. As you sit comfortably, you introduce that sacred word. When you're engaged with a thought, you detach from it. That's the practice, is returning ever so gently to the sacred word. And then at the end of the period, you just remain in silence for a few moments. One thing that I want to just absolutely emphasize is there's such a misconception that contemplative practices and mindfulness and meditation practices as well is that you're only doing it right, or you can only do it if you get to a place where you have no thoughts, where you just have a serene mind. It's comfortable. So many people say, I can't meditate or I can't do contemplative practices because my mind is always on the go. My mind is too busy. And that is the very opportunity. If your mind was completely silent, you would be in transforming union and you would be enlightened, and you wouldn't need, with the rest of us humans, a practice to start aligning and shifting our attention back to the divine. The fact that your mind is that busy is the very opportunity. And when you're doing centering prayer, when you have a thought and when you just gently, when you realize that you're not getting taken down into the stream and you're figuring it out and you're trying to solve it, it's when you can interrupt that. It's this whole disruption of the automatic thought patterns. And we're doing it again in centering prayer. We're disrupting it by saying, I'm coming back to my relationship with the divine. I'm not going back up into my mind. I'm staying here in my heart of heart. I'm staying here to bond. I'm not going to let you advocates and the mind thought processes, this isn't time for you. I hear you. I'm starting to go. I'm going to come back. And that's what the word does, is it brings us back into our heart of hearts. So those, again, those online links that I provided go into more about the choosing the sacred word and some of those types of details that I think you'll find very helpful. But don't limit your interest and your curiosity by thinking that you can't do it, that your mind is just too busy. When you start, maybe you do it as a walk around the block, or importantly, maybe you walk around the block before you do your sit. And we'll talk more about that, about those complementary practices around that really just start enriching our experiences with our primary practices. So in the end, what I just want to provide that gentle reminder again is that this introduction of contemplative practices and moving into our heart of hearts, moving from our minds, getting our foot behind that 1,000-pound door, it comes down to the simplicity again of turning toward during the most ordinary of lifestyle choices and the most ordinary of daily moments. This is all to increase our ability to persevere in doing that, in turning towards and shifting our attention back to the divine, then acting and seeing how that transforms those very patterns that we're hoping to. I hope you found this video complement helpful. If you have additional questions, which I hope you do, please know that there are, between the forums or commenting here or in our group meetings or in Thursday office hours, please bring those questions forward to the community. Whenever you hear that nudge, when there's something there, when the lighter voice, there's that lighter voice that's to contribute to community and to bring forward, and your question could be the very question that someone that isn't quite ready to be able to bring their voice forward, you could be that voice for them. And so I just encourage you, when you feel that nudge, find a comfortable way to express it and to bring it forward. It will do nothing but enhance our community and our understanding and our learning together. So enjoy. I'll see you in the guided practice, and I'm here for questions. Thanks so much for your attention. Bye-bye.